Okay, and I'm back. Sorry, was rudely interrupted there by Screencastify not working correctly, and it's still not. But anyway, so Plan B. So let me finish up where I was and moving on. Not too much left here. So I was talking about the features of a theocratic government, in this case for Massachusetts. So the church was, had a huge amount of authority. Church leaders, clergy, those people were like government officials almost. What the church said went. Your taxes paid to support the church. The Puritan church was the only one that was legal. You could not speak out against it. You could not practice things differently. You could not openly disagree. Church attendance was mandatory. You could be fined if you didn't go. So it was a very strict and rigid kind of society that really demands total compliance, and that really demands people never question and never think differently and never get out of line. And as you can probably imagine, that's a pretty hard thing to accomplish. In fact, darn near impossible. What the Puritans, seemed to be trying to create was, perfection. They were trying to create a, almost utopian kind of society that was perfect and holy and orderly and all of those things. But the problem with that is, as we all know, is people aren't perfect, and people do disagree, and people do argue about stuff. And that's just kind of human nature. And so Puritanism is, like I've already said, a difficult religion to follow and quite problematic because it is so rigid and it demands this complete and total adherence, complete orthodoxy, and nobody thinking outside of the box. And we know that just doesn't work. And so in the end, this is how we end up getting other New England colonies. They are going to be settled by and started sometimes by people who can't handle that can't handle the theocratic situation of Massachusetts, who disagree, and who either leave or, in some cases, who get flat out kicked out, because that happened plenty of times of people being, sort of excommunicated from their communities and their churches for what was seen as bad behavior or for disagreeing and all of that. So as I was saying towards the beginning of this, it is the descent from religion. And there's that word right there, descent. Not descend as to go down. But if you are a dissenter, that means you disagree. You're someone who's stepping up and saying, I disagree, I don't think that's right, here's what I think. And it is quite very much the dissent in Puritan communities that leads to the establishment of other communities in New England. There are lots of dissenters. There are plenty of people who got kicked out or got in trouble with Massachusetts or chose to leave Massachusetts because they didn't want to go to church or because they were drinking and gambling and doing all this other stuff. We're going to look at two of the most high-profile dissenters that kind of get the biggest name. That seem to cause the most trouble, because their dissent was not just, I'm not going to do what you say, but their dissent really challenged Puritan authority, really showed some of the cracks or potential cracks, what they saw as cracks in Puritan theology, and therefore was far more threatening to Puritan authority than just somebody who says, I don't want to go to church, or someone who's, out in the street, drinking or something like that. And in some cases, one of these cases will be someone that actually goes on to start another colony. So the first of these high-profile dissenters is a lady by the name of Anne Hutchinson. And Anne Hutchinson was a very strong-willed, devout Puritan. So the thing you're going to notice about both of these people, it's not that they're anti-religious. It's not that they say all this is silly. They just see things a different way. But both of these individuals are actually quite devout in their faith in one way or another. But Anne Hutchinson starts to hold meetings in her house where people are coming to listen to what she has to say about the scripture, what she has to say about what the preacher or the minister had said in church that week. She starts giving her own interpretations, and then she starts publicly disagreeing with the things that the ministers were saying, what they said certain scriptures meant, and all that sort of stuff. And then she goes even further. So already you can imagine that's considered pretty scandalous, is that she's disagreeing with authorities and she is saying she knows better. And she goes on to start to publicly challenge them. She goes on to start saying that she can tell who is saved and who isn't, who's destined for salvation and who isn't. And that was something that was just completely contrary to Puritan belief, because Puritans believed that God did not communicate with people that way, the way that Anne Hutchinson is claiming that God is speaking to her and God is revealing things to her. That was completely against Puritan theology. So this gets her in a lot of trouble. And as you can see, the fact that she's a woman probably doesn't help her as well. But this was very much rattling the cages. And, you know, because if Anne Hutchinson is going around saying that the authorities are wrong and that the people can interpret the Bible and that you don't have to listen to what the ministers say, because she starts going around saying, well, that one over there, he's not saved, so you don't even have to listen to him. Well, if she's going around saying that about authorities, about the people who are supposed to be in charge, you can see how potentially dangerous some people might find that to be. So Anne Hutchinson is eventually put on trial for heresy, for blasphemy, and she is found guilty and eventually banished. So this is a high-profile case, which means kicked out, and she and her family go settle a little further south in Massachusetts. But again, it represents how delicate this situation was and how, you know, someone challenging the authority or saying something different was really very dangerous to this particular kind of community. And once again, someone who wasn't just going around saying church is silly and we shouldn't have to do it. You know, she was a very devout person. She just saw things a little different. So it really shows how precarious this situation can be. Another important dissenter was a guy called Roger Williams. Again, someone who was not at all anti-religious. In fact, you know, Roger Williams was an extremely devout Puritan. In fact, he was probably more Puritan than other Puritans. He was actually a separatist who believed that the church needed, or the Puritans needed to separate from the Church of England totally. But where he thinks very differently is, as religious as he was, Roger Williams very much objected to the idea of forced religion, of making people go to church. He says that's not true religious devotion. That's not true devotion to God if it's like the law that you have to do it. That's not real faith. And he objected to the whole idea of theocracy. Roger Williams argued for what we today would call a separation of church and state, saying that the government and the religion shouldn't have anything to do with each other. Now, that phrase hadn't quite been coined yet, but that's what he was arguing for. He thought the government and religion shouldn't have anything to do with each other because he believed the government would corrupt religion, and that was offensive. He believed that, you know, God made covenants, God made relationships with individual people, whereas the Puritan church would argue that it was with the congregation. So kind of similar to what Anne Hutchinson was saying, I can interpret for myself, I can speak to God myself, and therefore ministers' authority isn't as great as they claim. He also, quite an unpopular opinion for the time, wanted to compensate, which means pay, Native Americans for their land that was being taken, and you can guess that that wasn't a very popular opinion. So Roger Williams is also put on trial and found guilty and is also banished. And so he goes and settles a little further south. And then eventually the settlement that he started, which was called Providence, and some of the other settlements around it that had been populated by people who had either left Massachusetts or been kicked out of Massachusetts. In 1644, those areas sort of combine together and form a new colony, Rhode Island. So Roger Williams is considered the founder of another one of the New England colonies, Rhode Island. And again, he starts that colony on the basis of religious dissent. And since Roger Williams starts Rhode Island, and since he does that because he was kicked out of Massachusetts for his beliefs, you can guess that Rhode Island looks a lot different than Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, there would be a separation of church and state, a total separation of church and state from the beginning. And that's saying something, because even in colonies like, say, Virginia, that were not exactly theocracies, they still didn't have a separation of church and state, not a total one, because even if you lived in Virginia, your taxes supported the Church of England, whether you went there or not. Now, you didn't go to prison if you didn't go to church the way that you might in Massachusetts, but your taxes still supported the Church of England. In Maryland, your taxes supported the Catholic Church, even after they grant religious toleration. That is the case in nearly every colony. Most colonies still have a tax-supported church. There's only a small handful that never did, and Rhode Island is one of them, because, again, Roger Williams didn't believe believe in that. In Rhode Island, there was much greater religious diversity. There was much more religious freedom. You didn't have to be a church member in order to vote. Now, you still had to be a man and all those things, but church membership wasn't a requirement. So it's much more open and free as opposed to some of the New England colonies. Lastly, here we're going to look at the other two New England colonies. We're not going to go near into as much of their backstory, just very, very quickly, and a few of the unique things about them. Connecticut becomes another one of the New England colonies. It's founded in 1637, and the person credited as the founder of Connecticut is Thomas Hooker. He was a Puritan minister, and he and his congregation went and settled a little further south of Massachusetts in what eventually became Connecticut. One big reason was better farmland. They were looking for land that was more fertile than what you had in Massachusetts. But Thomas Hooker did have some disagreements with the Puritan church. He thought that all men ought to be able to vote, not just the church members. So while he wasn't like, getting banished and kicked out and causing a big mess, he did have some reasons to dissent from the Puritan church and want to move somewhere else. So he and his congregation are the first ones to go and start Connecticut. One of the things that makes Connecticut unique is a few years after its founding, settlers of Connecticut are going to adopt something called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And this is Connecticut's constitution. Now, a constitution means that it's, a written framework for their government. They have written the blueprint for what their government is going to look like. And the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is the first written constitution in America. They are the first colony to actually have a constitution that's written down and explicitly states what the government can do and therefore what they cannot do. So this is, you guessed it, another example of self-government. It's another example of these colonists very, very early on saying this is how we are going to govern ourselves, and belief in constitutions. Because the thing is, constitutions, as I just said, if you're explicitly stating what the government can do, you're also explicitly stating what they can't do. So it further demonstrates not just the commitment to self-government, but limited government. The idea that governments are not all powerful, that they can't just do everything that they want to. It also shows this commitment to a people's created government. If they, the settlers, made this constitution, then clearly they believe that people ought to have some kind of say-so in the formation of their government. And here's where it also even gets more technical than you may have realized. I said written constitution. There are many political ideas in the colonies that aren't exactly new. They think similarly to people in England, but a little bit different. In England, the idea of a constitution is much different. When people in England talked about a constitution, they weren't talking about a piece of paper. They saw that as more like just a set of ideas. It's an arbitrary thing. It's based on tradition. It's based on precedent, but they're not talking about an actual document. In the Americas, in the American colonies, starting with the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and then other colonies will fall in line and do the same thing, they are creating the idea that constitutions are written documents, that it is a piece of paper, that it is not just some set of arbitrary ideas that anybody can change and anybody can just make up stuff, but it has to be written down. And that's where we're eventually going to see sort of American ideas about government and English ideas about government that just don't always go together, and it will cause misunderstandings or, just not seeing eye to eye on things eventually. The last one we want to talk about is New Hampshire. And the founder of New Hampshire is a guy called John Mason. And this one I'm not going to say too much about. The main thing that attracted people there to settle was for fishing. Commercial fishing was the first economic activity that happened in New Hampshire. A lot of fishing towns, and fishing is always going to be a big part of the New England economy. And so those are your 4 New England colonies: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. Again, a common thing amongst most of them is religion in some way, shape, or form. That is the big thing that forms the development of those colonies.